Okay, that kind of response. That's wonderful. A well-behaved group. Let me welcome you sincerely. My name is Bonnie Diamond. I'm the executive director here. It is my great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to our beautiful museum and restored sanctuary. If you've never been here before, please make it your business to come back and visit. We have tours, we have concerts, we have festivals, we have classes, but most of all, our home is your home. We welcome everyone, and we are delighted you're here tonight. We welcome the China Institute, and right now I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Haley. But once again, please come back and enjoy our beautiful space. To one and all, thank you for coming.
Hi everybody, I'm Haley and I want to welcome you all here tonight. We're thrilled to have you. I always start off by asking, who's been here before? Show of hands. So I want to welcome those of you who've been here before back. We're so happy to have you. Who's never been here before? Oh my gosh, welcome for the first time and welcome up to the balcony. We're so happy to have you here. Elder Street's a really special place, and today we're all here for a panel discussion about Jewish lives in China. We're so proud to be presenting this panel with China Institute. Thank you so much for your support and dedication from the planning process until today. Before I welcome Jason Dizek to tell you a little bit more about China Institute and introduce your panelists, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the space we're in today. The building was built in 1887 by Eastern European Jews and flourished in this neighborhood until the mid-20th century. As people left the neighborhood, the sanctuary's doors were closed and shut until the space fell in disrepair. In the late 1980s, through generosity of visitors like you, a massive restoration project began to take shape. It took 20 years and $20 million, and now we've become a dynamic cultural institution that welcomes authors, artists, scholars, historians, and musicians to explore and celebrate Jewish life, history, and cultural preservation. If this mission speaks to you, please be sure to sign up for our mailing list so that you can return, pick up some information at the front desk, and consider making a donation so we can keep programs like this running and the museum open. Thank you again for coming. If the interplay of Jewish and Chinese culture interests you, come visit us again next week for a concert with East River Ensemble. You can find more information about that event in your brochure, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce James and Defiant.
Thank you so much. It's really a delight. I'm James Hanowitz. I'm the president of China Institute. And China Institute was founded in 1926, so we've been around for 93 years. And our mission is to help Americans have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of China. And at this particular juncture, I can't think of a more important time. We're also about engagement and collaboration. So we're delighted to be here collaborating with the museum and engaging with all of you. These are troubled times, and we need now more than ever to think about how, when I think about the role of Jews in China, and I think about the role of China Institute, I think about the concept of trust, and I think about the concept that America at this moment really doesn't feel comfortable and trust a lot of what China is saying and doing. And a lot of that, I think, is driven out of not knowing enough. So we're not around to say anything political or to dive into the issues in that regard, but what we are around to do is to connect people at a human level. Because I believe from the bottom of my heart that China and the United States are probably the two most important countries to occupy this planet for the next chunk of time. And we're allowed to disagree on a whole host of issues, but at the same time, it's our obligation and duty. We have to find areas that we can collaborate on. We have to find areas that we can work together in areas of common interest. And I believe deeply that there are areas of common interest and that we can collaborate on those things. And it starts with understanding where we've come from and the communities that are engaged with this process. We're about to dive into the panel, but I know that Dinda wanted to say a few words just before we get started.
Wonderful, thanks. I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the Director of Programs at China Institute. Just wanted to tell you just a little tiny bit more about the programs. We do a whole host of programs in the area of arts and culture and business and technology and all kinds of social issues. And just to to give you a sense of the sort of range, we just recently hosted a conversation about the Huawei problem and the U.S.-China tech war, and we have, of course, this wonderful program today, and next week we're convening a discussion about Is China the Enemy, featuring two of the giants in China studies, Ezra Vogel and Orville Schell. And just following that, we're actually going to be doing a kind of a blowout food and ideas festival on Saturday, September 21st, which is going to feature conversations about food, the environment, design, and art, and also we'll have food, drink, and fun stuff for sale, and even a Chinese rap star from Chengdu. So without further ado, I want to introduce this wonderful panel that we've got tonight. I want to start, though, by asking how many people here in the room were actually born in Harbin? Can you put your hands up? Was anybody born in Harbin? Yeah. Is there somebody? Yes? Okay, wonderful. And how many people were born in Shanghai? Is there anybody? There we go. Okay. So hopefully you can all talk to each other after this program and connect. That's absolutely fascinating and wonderful. So I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. Our amazing panel is going to be moderated by James, who he himself has some distant relatives who have lived in Harbin and Shanghai. And I also want to thank my wonderful colleague Erin Nicholson, by the way, who worked so hard to track down our amazing panelists. So James is going to be in conversation with Jim Ross, Northeastern University professor, who wrote a great book called Escape to Shanghai, A Jewish Community in China. And then to his right is Irene Klerman, who's a journalist and writer who collects stories about Jewish people who were in China. And finally, we have an amazing speaker this evening. We're so delighted to have Varda Yoran, who was born in 1929 in Mukden, and then lived in Tianjin with her Russian parents for the first 20 years of her life. And she's here with us today. So we're so excited. Over to all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim. I just wanted to add one personal note. As a Jewish boy who's lived more in China than he has here, 33 years in China, married to a Chinese person, this takes on a very sort of personal topic for me as well. So let's get started. I thought that I would start with Jim and ask Jim to sort of help us set the stage with a sort of a brief historical overview. And, when did you start migrating, and where were Jewish families coming from, and how did they end up in China?
Sure. Is this on? First of all, it's just such a privilege to be here. And the people who were born in China, this is their story, not my story. I was just fortunate enough to be able to meet so many folks from Shanghai, so many people who survived their years in Shanghai, and it was an honor for me to tell their story. So, a little bit of background. There were basically 4 Jewish communities in Shanghai. The first, predominantly were called Sephardic Jews, originally from Baghdad, have lived in India, many of them for years. They were the names that you know: Sassoon, Kaduri, Toig, Abraham, etc., Hardun. They are known as being incredibly wealthy Jews. They're known by many Chinese as being the folks that brought opium to China. So that doesn't make them necessarily well loved in China. But they built hotels, offices, they controlled the major trading companies, they ran schools, and for the most part, this community was fairly small. It was about 1,000 people at its largest. Most arrived in the late 19th, early 20th century. The Sassoons came in 1850. They came rather early and built a marvelous synagogue that is still standing in Shanghai. And just a plug for one of my colleagues, the director of the School of Journalism, Jonathan Kaufman, a New York boy, has just written a book that's coming out in Viking called The Last Kings of Shanghai, about the Sephardic Jews, about the Baghdadi Jews. Enough plugs. The second major community is the Russian Jewish community. That peaked at about 30,000 people, and a lot of them were white Russians who fled the Bolsheviks. There were also Jews who fled from Manchuria, came after the Japanese conquered Manchuria in the early 1930s. There was a sizable community, about 1,000, of Polish yeshiva students. And they came late in the war. In fact, one entire yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva, which still is here in New York, was able to escape to Shanghai and flourished in Shanghai. And finally, the community that I focused on, the Jewish refugees from Europe, from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, etc. They first started coming in 1933, 1934. The first refugees were mostly doctors. They settled in the interior after they got to Shanghai, and a lot of them disappeared. The others that came over the years established businesses in Shanghai, newspapers, magazines, a radio show. They did very well in their early years. Cafes, and in some ways, the refugees from Shanghai will tell you that it appeared to them like they were back in Berlin or Vienna, because there were these restaurants and cafes where they could hang out and talk. There was great musicians in Shanghai, so it was a very, in some ways, similar to the European Jewish community that they had left. Nightclubs, clothing stores. Most of the Jews lived in the Hangzhou section, which was controlled by the Japanese. It was probably the poorest section of Shanghai. But for these folks, particularly the young people who came over, this was the most fantastic thing they'd ever seen. The sights, the smells, and the sounds of Shanghai. Just those of you who were there know the sound of the men pulling carts down the street screaming, "Mudong, Mudong." Those were the refuse carts that they'd come by to the so-called toilets and collect the waste. And those were the kinds of sounds and smells that people dealt with in Shanghai every day. It was very, very different. The kids had a wonderful time growing up in Shanghai for the most part. The older people, not so much. I think a lot of the older people had been professionals and academics in Germany and Austria, and it was very, very hard for them to adjust. Some of them committed suicide, some of them ended up extremely poor, dying from disease, malnutrition. In the later days, when conditions were really bad in Shanghai, they were walking, some of these older folks were walking around wearing flour sacks. That's how bad their life was. But most of the refugees, when they got there, they called them camps or heims. They were a sort of dormitory that they lived in, rather crowded. About 5,000 people lived in the heims, in the dormitories. There were many people who were receiving free meals from the Jewish community as well. And I guess just to wrap it up a little bit, the doors officially closed in August 1939, although another 2,500 came after that. But the Japanese said that they wouldn't accept any more refugees after August 1939. Nonetheless, there were a number of refugees who came later via the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The Jews from Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia came by ship for the most part from Italy, from Genoa, from Trieste, on Conte Biancamano, and other ships. And thousands came that way. But the Trans-Siberian Railroad was sort of the last way to get there. Cold winters, lots of disease, monsoons, horrible rain in Shanghai, which I've experienced. And the Europeans were really vulnerable to the difficult conditions there. A lot of people got very sick, died from disease, because they weren't used to these diseases, weren't European diseases. And of course, back in that day, there wasn't any kind of penicillin. There was no way to treat these diseases effectively. So a lot of people, unfortunately, died from that. But there were marvelous stories, innovative businesses. One of my favorite stories is that one of the Jewish merchants figured out how to manufacture yahrzeit candles in Shanghai and sold them to the Chinese, who could not believe that there was a candle that would 24 hours. So that was one of the very successful businesses in China. But I think I've run on too long, so I'll stop there.
No, you haven't run out at all. And before we move to Irene, I just wanted to see if you could give us a little background, because you talked a little bit about the Sephardic Jews, about Ashkenazis. If they were coming from such diverse regions, how is it, what was the impetus? Is it for the same reasons that they came in around the same time, or what was the impetus to get them to go migrate to China?
The Sephardis came primarily, I mean the Sassanids in particular, because the government of India was taxing them really heavily, so they decided they'd be better off. Some of the Sassanids remained in India, but they ended up going to Shanghai because they thrived there business-wise. It was for economic reasons for the most part. The European Jewish refugees, for obvious reasons, left because their lives were in danger under the Nazi control of Europe, and that's why they started leaving in the early 30s, late 30s. And I didn't say this, but it's important. Shanghai was an open port. It was one of the treaty ports that had been opened by foreigners, for foreigners, and it was the only place in the world that people could go without a visa and even a passport in some cases. The Japanese, for whatever reasons, let the refugees into Shanghai. Not necessarily because they were trying to be good people. I think part of it, they thought that they could have a positive influence on the Americans by giving refuge to the European refugees. And the Russian story is more complicated, but I'm going to let our other guests talk about that.
Okay, thank you. Above all, this is a human story. And thank you for that introduction and that sort of setting the stage. But I'd like to turn to Irene now. Irene, you come from a Russian Jewish family, lived in Harbin for many years. And now that we sort of have that sort of academic background, I'm hoping you can personalize it a little bit for us and maybe give us some feeling and color about how your family ended up there, what it was like for them, and maybe tell it through your own perspective and lens.
My family story, by the way, is featured downstairs on the panels. A beautiful show organized.
Yeah, closer.
There's a beautiful show downstairs organized by the museum. That chronicles my family's story, as with a lot of photos from my family album. Jews came to Harbin, which became a Russian city, in the very late 1800s, because the Tsar had built his railroad, the Chinese Eastern Railroad connected to the Russian Railroad, and the Tsar needed Russians to settle in this fishing village called Harbin on what was then the Sungari River. It's now the Songhua River. And who would want to go to the middle of nowhere in this village that was basically mud and settle? And the Tsar got a great idea. Well, Jews in Russia at that time were not allowed to move from one town to the other. And there were quotas for Jews in the universities. It was a very narrow situation. But the Tsar said, well, okay. The Tsar said, Jews, if you want to go somewhere, you can go to Harbin. Take the railroad. There are 8 time zones in Russia. It took 3 weeks to get across. You can leave. Go ahead. Go to Harbin. So the people just hold close to your mouth. So the people I'm sorry about this. I'm not a professional speaker. The people who went tended to be either really desperate or pioneers. I think my family, they were both. My grandmother, when she was 5 years old, experienced the famous 1905 pogrom in Odessa, hiding in the attic for 3 days with her mother and baby sister, no food, and people being slaughtered all around. She talked about it. I was born after the war. She was still talking about it. So after Harbin about the same time on his own as a teenager, about 15, from a small town in the Ukraine called Orinian. And he was desperate. He was from a very poor family. His father had been a Talmudic scholar. And that meant that he sat in a room and studied Talmud while a series of wives would be working and having babies and dying. And so there were 3 wives and a very unhappy family. So my grandfather went to Harbin. He was not very educated because there was no money. He was speaking Yiddish. My grandmother was from a more Russian-speaking family, but she knew some Yiddish. And he could barely write Russian, but he was a really hard worker. He started working, doing labor anywhere he could, and then in World War I, he went to America for a couple of years. He was in New York, washing windows and saving his money, and because he wanted to escape being drafted into the Tsar's army. Jews in general did not want to go into the Tsar's army or the Bolshevik army. So he came back to Harbin with plumbing supplies from the United States. He'd buy all kinds of used things that they didn't have in Harbin. They didn't have goods. They didn't have, and he went into the salvage business. He would buy railroad cars and take them apart. And my father, when he was a little boy, his job was to go to my grandfather's lumber yard and sit there hammering the nails to straighten them out because he didn't waste anything. So his job was straighten the nails so he could sell them and use them to build buildings. He built a number of buildings in Harbin, none of which are still standing, but the biggest one, everybody in the family called it the building because it was so important. It was in the center of Harbin, 3 stories of apartments. And he also had horses. He loved horses. He had race horses. And in Harbin, the streets were mud and gas was expensive and the winters are terrible. It gets down to -20 in the winters. So a lot of people had horses, or they would hire horse carriages like the kind they have in Central Park. But my grandfather, because he was prosperous, he had his own carriages and then he had his own race horses. And one of his apartment buildings we were pictured was a very big gate, and that was so that the carriage could go through. It was very romantic for my grandmother. My grandfather was a really difficult man. He carried a gun everywhere. Harbin was the Wild West, except it was in the East. My grandmother said, well, he was a good provider, and he really was. And they had 3 children. My father was the oldest child, and he went to, the Japanese occupied Harbin in 1932. They came into Manchuria in 31, and they occupied Harbin. My father remembered as a child watching the tanks of the Japanese come in. And as time went on, there were kidnappings of foreigners. There was a collaboration with the White Russians who were coming after the Bolshevik Revolution. They had to leave Russia, so they came to Harbin, and they brought with them the anti-Semitism that all these Russian Jews were escaping from. And so they were quite organized. There was a White Russian fascist party in Harbin. They had a newspaper, and they collaborated with the Japanese. So when the Japanese didn't want to get blamed for some horrible torture or kidnapping, they would get the Russian fascists to take people. And a number of my family's friends were taken. In 1937, my father graduated from Russian high school, went to the United States to study at the University of California in Berkeley. But right in 1938, my grandfather was taken. He disappeared. They think the Japanese wanted his cattle operation. He had a cattle feedlot. They wanted his buildings, and they did this to a number of wealthy people in Harbin. And my grandfather was never seen again. In many of the kidnappings, there was ransom requested. And sometimes the person came back, and sometimes they were tortured to death. In my grandfather's case, there was no ransom, and that's what people thought, that the Japanese simply wanted him out of the picture. And after that, of course, the property started to be unmanageable. My grandmother had no way to manage it, and she had 2 young children. Eventually, she went to Shanghai, and there were many Russian Jews who were starting to move to Shanghai to get away from the occupation. and they were there during the war. But my father was stuck in the United States, and he was told, in fact, I have the telegram that was sent, don't come back, no use. They were afraid if he came back, he'd get kidnapped too. And so he waited, he said he knew there would be a war, and he waited for the United States to declare war on Japan, and then he volunteered, and that's how he became a citizen. He volunteered to go back to Asia to fight for his father. And which he did, he was in a company called Merrill's Marauders, which if you know American war history, was on the Burma Road and fought terrible battles there. After the war, he found his mother and brother and sister in Shanghai and brought his mother and brother to the United States. My aunt couldn't get a visa, so she ended up making Aliyah to Israel. So I have a cousin who's a Sabra. And I was born, my father met my mother after the war, the first Thanksgiving after the war. The Harbin community in San Francisco, where I'm from, was very tight. And so, of course, he went to his uncle from Harbin, and all the Harbin people were there, and all the Russians were there, and my mother was there, and that's when they met and married. And my mother was not as enamored with the history of Harbin as he was at all. She was born in Vladivostok. She was from a Russian-speaking Jewish family, but they escaped to Harbin because the Bolsheviks were after them. My grandfather was a wealthy grain merchant. And so they were only in Harbin for 3 years. They got visas and were able to come to San Francisco. My mother grew up American, even though she was speaking Russian. But they married, and then I was born, and the rest is history.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm not sure how it leaked, but the information leaked. Varda, born in Mukden, which is now Shenyang, I don't know how it leaked, but 1929, I don't know if that's really a true date or not, was born there. And I understand you spent your formative years, first 20 years of your life, growing up in Mukden. And so let me turn it over, and maybe I got that wrong. So I would be delighted if you could also just give us your thoughts and views and give us a little insight into how you ended up started out in China.
I wanted, first of all, to point out that in China there was no anti-Semitism. And that's considering what happened in the Chinese. I grew up in. Will it help if I stand?
No, you don't need to stand. Just hold it a little closer. Perfect.
There were two. I grew up from the age of 8 in Shenzhen until 8. First I was born in Baghdad, then we went to Defiant for a few years, from between 2 and 8, and then we went to Shenzhen. I grew up in Shenzhen mainly from the age of 8 until 20. Now, in Shenzhen, it was a pretty large city, and there were many Indians and Germans, and there were two, actually, civilizations. There was the Chinese people and the non-Chinese people. And it didn't matter to the Chinese people whether we were Jews or not. And they treated us pretty well. I'll start off by telling you a little bit about my family background. My mother grew up in Crimea. She was 10 years old or so. She grew up in Crimea. When the communism started, there was famine there. She was one of 12 children. During the famine, 2 of her brothers died of starvation. The rest of the family was hungry, but the father was devastated. It just broke him physically, mentally, emotionally, every which way. So the mother had to take care of the sick husband as well as worry about the family. When my mother was was 10, the father died, and the mother was stuck with 10 children to raise. They were very poor. She had a very hard time. And later on, the oldest daughter got married to a man who was working on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and they went to Harbin. When my mother was 14, she went summer vacation to help her older sister in Harbin to raise her children, and she never went back to Russia. My father was born in Siberia, and he went to Harbin to help his uncle in his work. He had some kind of a business there. When my mother's sister's husband finished his job, the family had to move back to Russia, but my mother stayed on in China. She married my husband, my father, I mean, and then my sister and I, my twin sister and I, were born in Baghdad. From Baghdad, we went to Dhahran. And the Dhahran society was very different from the Tenzin society. In Dhahran, there was a very small Jewish community. There weren't many foreigners at all. And there was just one school, the Marino Academy, run by nuns, and all the other schools were either Chinese or Japanese. So everybody went to this Marino Academy. That's when we started learning English. There was a little club, and that turned into a synagogue on holidays. And on the whole, it was a lovely time. It was a lovely city, and I have very fond memories of it. Then, as far as Judaism is concerned, I knew nothing about anything. We moved to Tenzin, and I went to the Tenzin Jewish school. The Jewish community was self-sufficient. Not that we didn't need help, we simply didn't get any help. So the more affluent people took care of the poorer people, and they supported the school and the synagogue and the club. And there was kosher shochad, or kosher chicken, and my life centered around the school. The school, when the Jewish community started in Tenzin, they saw that there were kids running around in the streets because they didn't have money to go to the American and British schools. So they decided to create the Jewish school. And it was for those who couldn't go to the other schools. Eventually, it became a very, very good school. And in fact, when I was growing up there was an arrangement with Cambridge University that whoever did well in the final exams in our school was allowed to take Cambridge matriculation examination. And I must say the success level was approximately 100%. And all that had to come to, by the way, we graduated after 9 grades, not 12. But even so, we managed to reach the matriculation level of Cambridge. When, after Pearl Harbor, the Jews, the Americans and the British became enemies, and they were taken into internment camps outside of the city, not to compare to ghettos or concentration camps, but still they were proud of their liberty. And our school had to make do with any teacher who could take on the challenge of teaching us. And all the other kids who parents wanted them to have English as the main language came to our school. So we had Indians and Russian and Koreans and all kinds of children. And whoever couldn't afford to pay didn't pay. That I know because when I graduated, I years when we were growing up, we were totally, utterly, completely cut off from the rest of the world. Nobody in, nobody out, because there was a war between China and Japan, then afterwards the Japanese takeover, and then afterwards World War II. And then when World War II ended, when the Japanese surrendered after the atom bomb, there was a tremendous inflow of American Marines into China. They didn't expect that there would be five faces other than Chinese in the population there. And everybody opened their homes to the Marines, and even families that didn't have young children, the Marines would come back to their grandparents to have some meals or something. And it was a beautiful time for us, very exciting, all these young men, and it was a lot of fun. Anyway, then when the communists took over China, Mao decided that there was a war that lasted for several years. By the time it arrived into our part of the world, it was about 1948. Mao wanted China for the Chinese only, and all foreigners out. So everybody had to go somewhere. And the Jews, where would they go? Wherever they were accepted. In Australia, America, it was difficult to get into America. And just at that time, very, very luckily for us, Israel became independent. So many went to Israel. By that time, the community began to clear out, and they closed the schools. And there was the community that we knew no longer existed. That's it.
So we're going to open it up to questions, but I just thought that I'd start off and ask because it's such fascinating stories. Varda, so what I understood from your story was it's really not World War II that drove your family from China, but rather Mao's taking over and the advent of communism and China for Chinese.
That drove us out of China, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
And when you were in China,
Yes.
would you say that it was like a parallel existence, or was it in some ways integrated with the Chinese communities there too?
Well, not only that we didn't really integrate with the Chinese communities, but all the other communities were separate too. We had nothing to do with the Russian community, we had nothing to do with the American, and there was a club, but it was very difficult for Jews to get in. The British had their own lives. It was very fragmented. And I personally had one Chinese little girl friend when we were living in Shenzhen from the age of about 10. She was our age. On our floor there were two apartments, the Chinese apartment and the house. And we played with that little girl until very shortly after that she died. And that was really the only real Chinese child that we played with. Otherwise, our lives centered around the school. The social life, everything centered. We didn't have the opportunities here of going horseback riding and skating and all the rest of it. Even if we would have had the opportunity, my family couldn't have afforded it. Because my father had a very, very, very hard time making a living in China. So we didn't really have much of a life outside of school as a child.
So I'm going to open up to the audience, but just before I do, I wanted to ask Jim another question, because what you sort of described sounds a little bit like what Jim writes about ghettos that existed in Europe, Jewish ghettos, and about a Jewish ghetto that was in Shanghai. But the way you describe it, Varda, is not really so much a ghetto, but a parallel community. I see you shaking your head. You wouldn't really describe it as a ghetto.
Not at all, not at all. Originally, before the war, the city was divided into concessions. There was the French concession, the English concession, the German concession, the French concession, and the Jews lived predominantly in the English British concession and some in the French concession. When the war began, when the Japanese occupied China, they eliminated the concessions, but we still continued calling them that because that was how we identified the various areas. There was no official separation between the various concessions. It's just somehow people didn't mingle that much among themselves. There was certainly no ghetto.
Yeah, I think that it was generally true in Shanghai. Oops, we're getting feedback. Try that one. This one better?
No, two speakers together. Move it away. Move the speakers separate.
Throw that one away. Yeah. Hello?
No.
Testing? No? Testing. Okay. In Shanghai, there were, in fact, separate communities. Not only British, French, Russian, Japanese, but the Jewish communities themselves were pretty separate. The Sephardic Jews kept to themselves for the most part. The European Jews, in fact, even in some cases, the German, the German and the Austrian Jews did get along with each other.
It's those two speakers. Turn one off. Turn it off. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Here we go.
What? Just the speaker is feeding back to the microphone. See the speaker? It's amplified through the microphone and you're getting feedback. Okay? It's just a bad placement. The speaker should be back this way.
It's the ghost of the synagogue house.
Stand up.
Sure.
We'll be able to hear.
Yeah, okay. I'll try that. I don't think I need a mic actually, so can you all hear me without a mic?
Yes.
Good. Let's do it that way. You can have this. But you can't hear me with the feedback. Yeah. Okay. So the communities in Shanghai, as in the other cities of foreigners in China, tended to be separate from one another for the most part. They did things together. I mean, my favorite story is that the German, Austrian kids hung out with Chinese kids who were their age, and the German and Austrian kids learned great Chinese swear words. They shocked the people in China with their great command of Chinese swear words. But this situation changed dramatically in February of 1943, because that is when the Japanese issued the proclamation. The proclamation stated that all stateless refugees had to live in a designated area of Hongqiu. Now, stateless refugees are those who arrived after 1937 from Germany, Austria, etc. Didn't include the Russian Jews, didn't include the Polish Jews. So there was this 1 square mile area of Hongqiu, the formerly all Japanese section, where all of the Jewish refugees from Europe were commanded to live. And that was after February 1943.
Living conditions after that, till the end of the war, were much worse. There was no, I mean, this was not a fenced-in ghetto. This was not a walled-in ghetto. There was no barbed wire. But there was a police force made up of Jewish refugees called the Palcha, who policed the ghetto to make sure that people weren't leaving. To get out of the ghetto designated area is probably a better term, they had to have a permit. And the permits were issued by the Japanese. And the Japanese who were in charge of this were incredibly cruel. There was a fellow who was legendary among people from Shanghai called Goya. Goya was a tiny man. I don't think he was much more than 4.5 feet tall. And he would scream and berate and hit the refugees, refuse to give them passes, make them come back day after day after day for weeks at a time. Very nasty man. On the other hand, he loved to have his pictures taken with the refugees. He loved going to their concerts and their shows. He's a very strange, conflicted man, but he was the one in charge. They had to line up for Goya. And a lot of people, because they couldn't get permits, it was very hard for them to survive. You needed that permit to work, to get out of the designated area so you could work in the offices, the factories that were outside of the designated area. So that made it a very difficult time. Why did the Japanese decide to create this designated area? It's a very good question. I never got a very good answer. There's some theories, as with all this. One theory is that the White Russians, the anti-Semitic White Russians, convinced the Japanese that that's what they needed to do. Because the Jews were cheating and stealing, because they're horrible people, a whole variety of reasons. Another possible reason was because there were some Jews in Hongqiu who were very active in the black market. And the Japanese didn't like that. It was undercutting their authority in Shanghai. But whatever the reason, this designated area lasted until the end of the war. And a couple things I want to say about these days. One is that in some ways as isolated as these folks in Shanghai were for all these years, they were getting letters from their relatives in Europe. And they were getting news to some degree from Europe up until a certain point. And then it all stopped. And they were extremely worried about the survival of their families. And they were hearing rumors about extermination camps, but they really didn't know what was going on. In the fall of 1944, after the Russians had taken over Treblinka, the Russians made a famous newsreel of Treblinka, of the death camp in Treblinka. And the people, the bodies there, the survivors there, and that film was shown in a theater in Shanghai. And the Shanghai refugees sat there and watched, stunned, as they finally found out what had happened to their relatives. And one of the stories that I heard about watching that movie is one of the people who was watching the movie jumped up and saw this ghostly figure on the screen and pointed and said, "Mein Bruder, mein Bruder." And his brother had survived, and he saw him on this film, and that's how he found out. So that is some of the story of what happened in the so-called ghetto, the designated area of Shanghai.
Before I open it up, I just wanted to ask one question. I wanted to ask Irene and Varda, if you think there's a kind of a urban myth that there is a connectivity in the values and the culture between Jews and Chinese, and that we share a lot of the same sort of human values. And I was wondering if you can comment on that and if you believe that to be true in any kind of special way.
Very much. First of all, the importance of very true. First of all, the value of education.
It's cut from the audio. It's cut
Not
from
on.
the main audio.
It's not on.
Try another one.
The value of education and family. That is common both to the Jews and the Chinese. Also,
How about I amplify? Varda's saying that the value of education and family, above all, were united in connecting Jews and Chinese.
Also, I was talking with a professor, a Chinese professor, and we were talking about the comparison, the similarities, and they were saying that the suffering that they suffered at the hands of the cruelty of the Japanese towards them was pretty much comparable to the suffering that the Jews got at the hands of the Germans.
So for those of you who didn't hear, Varda was comparing the way that Chinese people suffered under Japanese occupation to the way that Jews in Europe suffered under Nazi occupation of Germany.
And that's why the professor was saying we have so much in common.
And that was so much in common.
Yes.
Did
There
we
was
back on?
one thing I wanted to say, and it's easier for me like that. An epilogue. After everybody had to leave, China.
It's better than you amplify.
After everybody. After everybody had to leave China, many went to Israel, and many spread out to other countries, to America and so on. And those that came to Israel created an organization called the Far Eastern Organization that united all these people who were scattered everywhere, from Harbin, from Shanghai, from Tianjin, from everywhere. And we had the chief office is in Tel Aviv. 70 years later, it still exists. The chief office is in Tel Aviv, but there are branches in New York, in San Francisco, in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, and in Sydney, Australia. And there's a magazine that keeps things up to date and tells stories from the past and addresses. And we had a reunion in our house 50 years after our graduation from the high school. So we put a notice in the bulletin, and we had people coming from Israel and from Canada and all that. And this organization does wonderful things. First of all, they give grants to scholarship funds to children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of us who lived in China. And there are plots and cemeteries where people who can't afford a decent burial. There are gifts to the soldiers in the military, also grandchildren, great-grandchildren who served in the Israeli military. And also, they did a tremendous job in bonding the relationship between China and Israel. And now, the synagogues in China are beginning to be turned into museums, so that they can tell the story of the Jewish communities in China.
Stand up. Oh yeah, that does work better. My family and all the Harbin Jews I grew up around were extremely proud of being from China. They were Jews from China. It made them really special, and part of what made it special for them was this tremendous respect for a 5,000-year-old culture. And the Chinese were all over Asia, but they also had a base so they could established artwork, and everyone had Chinese artwork. You know, Jews had to travel so much, they didn't have big monuments, but the Chinese did, and everyone seemed to adopt those monuments as their own, and everyone had a Buddha in their house, and everyone had Chinese rugs if they could afford it. And of course, the respect for education, and we both have scrolls. We put all our sacred writings on scrolls. It just goes on and on. It's true that there was not a lot of socializing. There was only a little bit of intermarriage, and it was frowned upon. There was a lot of racism probably on both sides. But there was huge respect on both sides too.
Thank you. So we have some time left. I thought that I would open it up to the audience. I'll try to get to as many people as I can. So I think